All right, let's get going here. Welcome to everyone who's on the call today. We appreciate you taking that time. It does look like we are expecting a number of participants to join us, but we will get started as I know there's a lot to cover. It's a very exciting time to be involved in environmental work, and there are many opportunities developing within this sector, including ecosystem service policy, the topic of today's webinar. This particular webinar would not be possible without Silvacom and the speakers today, Toni and Andrew. So we thank you for joining us and for preparing this for us. It would also not be possible without all of you who joined us on today's call. We look forward to hearing from you, and you can certainly participate in today's session by asking questions in the chat box or the Q&A box on the right-hand side. You can also stay connected with us after today's webinar, so you will have an opportunity to complete a survey and let us know what else you look forward to seeing from EcoCanada. And you will receive, again, follow-up after today's call in terms of we'll send a recording and the slides. So you don't need to worry about taking a ton of notes. You can always review the recording and slides after today's session. So Toni and Andrew, with that, I will hand it over to you, as I know there's lots to cover in terms of ecosystem services. So Andrew, if you want to get underway, you're welcome to it.
Great, thank you very much, and hello to everyone on the line. My name is Andrew Vandenbroeck, and I'm a project manager with the Energy and Environment Group at Silvacom. And presenting with me today is Toni Anderson, resource analyst with the Energy and Environment Group as well, and she leads many of our ecosystem services related initiatives. And just before we get started, just want to thank EcoCanada for giving us the opportunity to present today. And we're quite excited to be able to discuss some of the emerging trends happening right now in natural capital and ecosystem services. And also encourage you to continue the conversation. You can live tweet about this webinar and ecosystem services using the handles on the slide right now. So just to give you a bit of an overview of what we're planning to talk about today, we're going to start off. I'm just going to give a very brief overview of who Silvacom is and what we do. And then we'll jump right into the subject matter at hand. Toni will level set and take us through what ecosystem services are, and then start discussing what are some of the driving forces behind this. And then I will give an example of a case study that we're working on to pilot some of this ecosystem service initiative. And then Toni will then wrap everything up with some thoughts on the road ahead, opportunities and challenges, and takeaways from today's presentation. So who is Silvacom and what do we do? Silvacom is an employee-owned consulting firm providing software, data, and professional services to improve land management. We have over 80 staff within the Silvacom group, working in a variety of areas that include environmental management, forest management, GIS, and software development. And over the last few years, we've been growing and getting more heavily involved in the ecosystem services space. Silvacom is headquartered in Edmonton, and we work for a variety of clients in Western Canada and across North America, particular clients in the forestry, energy, utility, agriculture, and government, and as well as Indigenous communities. So that's a quick overview of who Silvacom is, and I'll turn it over to Toni now to start talking about ecosystem services.
Okay, thank you, Andrew. And good morning or good afternoon to everybody who is listening in. And thanks to EcoCanada for making this webinar possible. So like Andrew said, I'm just going to spend a few minutes to level set and define what ecosystem services are and how they fit into the natural capital accounting framework. And then we'll dive right into what that actually means for industry and policy in Western Canada. Ecosystem services are the benefits that nature provides to people. These can include, but aren't limited to, water filtration for safe, secure drinking water, carbon sequestration for climate regulation and clean air, and timber production for timber harvest. The key to ecosystem services is that they are directly linked to human well-being. So if you think about the boreal forest, it provides a number of ecosystem services that we perhaps take for granted. Healthy forests provide a sustainable timber supply, but they also sequester carbon for climate regulation, clean air. It also provides many recreational experiences like camping, hunting, and fishing, as well as traditional use for Indigenous communities. By translating everything into each of these benefits are measured in different units, making it difficult to understand what the trade-offs are if we were making a land use decision that was to impair one or more of these benefits. By translating everything into one unit, it reduces the risk that items that are bought and sold in traditional marketplaces are overvalued just because they're measured in dollars and they're best understood by decision makers. For example, we know that the market value of a sustainable timber supply is, but if we were to ask you what the recreational opportunities of the boreal forest were worth, we might not be able to answer that as quickly. But we know we'd be worse off for the most part if we are no longer able to fish, hunt, and camp on public land. The purpose of ecosystem service assessments is not to put a price on nature, but to highlight its value so it's not overlooked. So while we typically default to translating everything into a dollar unit, it's not necessary to do so. The purpose is just to measure a person's utility or satisfaction and what is lost if we were to lose a benefit from the landscape. People are generally more familiar with the term natural capital. Ecosystem services actually fit into the natural capital accounting framework, where natural capital is the stock or the entire inventory of natural resources, whether or not they're flowing to people. So as I mentioned before, ecosystem services are directly linked to human well-being. Sorry, just a second. Should I go closer to the mic? Oh, sorry, you guys having a hard time hearing me?
Yes, it's better when you speak up like that. That's great, Toni.
I'll just move closer to that microphone. Is this better?
Thank you. Yes.
So just to kind of reiterate, natural capital is the stock of natural resources on the landscape, and ecosystem services are the flows that go to people of natural resources or businesses. So as I mentioned before, ecosystem services are directly linked to human well-being, where natural capital is the stock, and it doesn't necessarily matter if it's benefiting or flowing to a person or a business. If you think of natural capital in a business sense, you can think of natural capital as your company's balance sheet, where the total assets and liabilities are listed. And ecosystem services is the current cash flow available for your company to use. So the point of these slides is not to get bogged down in the differences in terminology, but to highlight that nature fits into business processes in a number of different ways. We want to move away from seeing nature as a single issue or a sticking point, where companies are forced to meet regulatory compliances or be shut down, and take a systems approach to decision making where the environment is considered an asset along the continuum of the business process. So now that we've given a general idea of what ecosystem services and natural capital are, I'm going to dive into how decision makers are using these concepts in policy development, and then how industry is using it to become more resilient. I'm going to focus on Alberta as a case study because it's where my expertise is. But if you have any follow-up questions in different parts of Canada, I hope to be able to address these in our discussion or offline at a later date. Ecosystem service assessments have been taken up all around the world, either within policy, voluntary initiatives, or private investment. It really took off in Europe, especially with the release of the Millennium Assessment in 2005, over 10 years ago. But if we focus on North America, the United States recently committed to start incorporating ecosystem services into their federal agency planning processes following a memorandum released in 2015. And while that might change with the new president, it's still a very significant highlight that the United States wants to move in that way. And the U.S. Forest Service also manages for a mandate for providing ecosystem services in multiple uses in their forests. So they're not just focused on sustainable timber supply. In Canada, Environment Canada is about to release an ecosystem service toolkit that helps operationalize ecosystem services for decision making. This will include identifying easy entry points for current regulatory compliances and a framework to how to do an ecosystem service assessment. The Federal Sustainable Development Strategy also mentions that Environment Canada and Statistics Canada should provide scientific expertise and guidance and advice to decision makers to develop and apply models for social, cultural, and economic valuation of ecosystem services. Moving a little bit closer to home, in Alberta, the government's adopted an ecosystem service approach to their landscape management planning. Ecosystem services are mentioned as a possible tool to implement market-based approaches and encourage landowners to implement best management practices on their land for the provision of ecosystem services. There's also been a number of different private investments in ecosystem services. For example, Weyerhaeuser purchased Plum Creek timber last year, and it was said that ecosystem services were used in the valuation of Plum Creek to assess the true value of the company. Other companies are also using ecosystem service valuation to receive tax rebates through the sale of land, among other things. And the Natural Capital Protocol was released this past summer that provides a standardized framework for businesses to integrate natural capital into their decisions. The protocol has been widely adopted by many companies since its pilot, and the coalition is currently working on a number of sector guides, including a finance sector and forestry sector guide to be released within the year. So there are many common driving factors behind the uptake of ecosystem services assessments globally. But today I'm just going to focus on one main one, which is a shift to outcome-focused regulation, and specifically the use of conservation offsets. But it's also important to highlight that a lot of companies are interested in doing this just to maintain social license to operate, or to identify access to new revenue streams, and also to reduce operational risk, which I'll touch on a little bit, but the main focus will be on conservation offsets. So when non-Albertans are asked to describe what the Alberta economy is, typically most people go directly to the oil and gas sector, or more specifically the oil sands. But it's important to note that Alberta has many different thriving industries, including forestry, agriculture, and livestock. And these industries do have many competing land uses that have to operate on the same land base and meet the same government regulations. Alberta also has a defined split in its public and private lands. So approximately 40% of the province is privately owned, and it's predominantly in the southern region of the province. The remainder is public land, and that's where the majority of oil and gas and forestry operations are occurring. So I'm going to dive into the current policies that the government has put in place to allow for the use of conservation offsets. Specifically, the government is committed to using policy, regulations, and economic instruments to grow the green economy and also diversify the economy, and with that have shifted the regulations to focus on outcomes and not necessarily how to get to those outcomes. To do this, the province has two distinctive acts in place that allow for the use of conservation offsets to meet ecological goals. The Land Stewardship Act divides the province into 7 planning regions with their own ecological targets and thresholds, and the Water Act, which enables the wetland policy and the use of offsets. There's also an upcoming conservation offset framework that will ensure the goals of both these acts remain aligned. So we're just going to talk about each individually and then explain what that means. to industry. So as I mentioned, the Land Stewardship Act divides the province into 7 regions with all different but similar management priorities based on different landscapes. Each region has or will have their own biodiversity management framework, which sets thresholds that cannot be surpassed. This can be the amount of disturbance on the landscape, the amount of old-growth forest, interior habitat, and so on. These indicators are chosen based on extensive stakeholder consultation addressing what's meaningful to protect for people in the region. While the indicators and thresholds set out in the biodiversity management framework are similar between regions, how the government suggests industry remains below the thresholds can vary between regions. In the south, because there's large tracts of privately owned land, payments for providing ecosystem services on the landscape is a major driver. But in the north, where it's mostly publicly land, there's issues around permanence and ownership of footprint, so payments for ecosystem services doesn't necessarily work. That's where the government's starting to rely more on the idea of conservation offsets. This doesn't mean that industry in the north aren't concerned about ecosystem services, because if they're to prioritize restoration in an area where there's what I like to say ecosystem service hotspots, or areas that have a lot of ecological value, they may be eligible for a number of conservation offsets. One restoration project may provide a species at risk habitat, carbon credits, and water quality credits, which can all be split into their own. So the second policy, as I mentioned, is the wetland policy, which has been effective for the entire province since July 2016. 21% of Alberta is covered by a wetland, and over time, wetlands in this province have been significantly altered or destroyed by urban sprawl, expanding agriculture, and other human development. People are now realizing that wetlands have social, ecological, and economic importance, and they need to be conserved or protected. The wetland policy follows the mitigation hierarchy, where it states that if developments to affect a wetland, the operator must do what they can to avoid, then minimize their impact, and offset what they cannot avoid through either restoration or payment into an offset fund. So you might be asking where ecosystem services fit into this policy. The policy recognizes that not all wetlands are created equal. When a wetland must be replaced or offset, it's not based on a hectare per hectare basis, but what the total value of the wetland was. So key criteria that are assessed are biodiversity, water quality improvement, flood reduction, and human values like recreation and cultural significance. Lastly, the government's working to release the draft conservation offset framework to ensure consistency across different regions of the province. There are already a number of different initiatives that outline offsets as a tool to meet government-defined outcomes, like we already mentioned, the wetland policy and the land use framework. There's also the specified gas emitters regulation to reduce greenhouse gases, and different individual project approvals, like the Shell's Jack Pine Mine oil sands mine expansion. I don't know why I have a hard time saying that every time, as well as a pilot in the native prairie conservation efforts. So the framework will ensure that the same guiding principles are used in all offset initiatives. Specifically, that credits are stackable, so there can be one buyer for water quality credits and another for carbon, and so on. So the enabling legislation is almost complete to encourage the buying and selling of conservation offsets in the province, but there's still a need to develop a marketplace where these offsets can be bought and sold, and enough industry interest to make it worthwhile. That's where Ecosystem Service and Biodiversity Network comes in. The network was established formally in 2015 and is made up of a number of organizations dedicated to advancing Alberta's knowledge surrounding ecosystem services and biodiversity. The group is completing significant research to fill the knowledge gaps needed to ensure the successful launch of ecosystem services within policy in the province. The group also works with a large number of stakeholders to build community understanding of what ecosystem services are and why they're important to Albertans. In doing so, the hope is that increasing public awareness around the value of natural capital will encourage private sector uptake. The last piece of the puzzle to ensure that ecosystem services are taken up in the province is having access to high-quality data that can measure the changes in ecosystem services through restoration or best management practices. There are a number of different models out there to use, but if the underlying data isn't good enough, the results won't be accurate enough to facilitate a marketplace. Furthermore, with the impending release of the Conservation Offset Framework, there's been significant interest from the private sector to complete ecosystem service assessments, but there hasn't been significant uptake to date. Lack of high-quality data that's uniform across the province and publicly accessible is a possible reason for this. The Alberta Biodiversity and Monitoring Institute is responsible for maintaining high-level inventories of land cover and human footprint for the entire province. They also have access to on-the-ground biodiversity data that's collected annually. Using this information, they've developed province-wide ecosystem service models for 5 ecosystem services and are working on a 6th, which is recreation. Furthermore, using the land cover data that ABMI provides, we're able to map ecological hotspots, or ecosystem service hotspots, of high ecological value for the entire province, which can help prioritize where restoration should occur to offset new development. To help bring all of this data together under one data warehouse, the Bioresource Information Management System was created as a central data repository. The BRIM's vision is to have access to dependable, up-to-date, spatially explicit data about Alberta's biomass and ecosystem services that will assist in investment decisions. Having all the data available in one spot will help standardize how it's collected and ensure all operators are working with the same data, which will be essential if a marketplace is created where offsets can be bought and sold. And then lastly, we want to make this data publicly accessible. BRIMS is set to launch in the first quarter of this year. It'll be a geospatial web-enabled application that will be free to use. And using the underlying data in the data warehouse, users will be able to easily target and customize search locations, build scenarios, and assess land use trade-offs. So now I'm going to hand it over to Andrew. He's going to discuss a case study of how the energy sector is piloting ecosystem services in Alberta. So Andrew, it's all yours.
Great, thank you. Yeah, so we're going to just walk through a case study tying in some of those ecosystem service concepts and how those were being applied to sort of practical application in the kind of an offset framework idea. And this is using an industry-led restoration project as a case study. So I'm going to spend just a few slides talking through the background of that project, and then we'll come back and tie it into ecosystem services assessment afterwards. So this was a habitat-focused restoration project. And just to provide some context, the woodland caribou boreal population are a threatened species in Canada under the Species at Risk Act. Boreal caribou are distributed broadly throughout the boreal forest in Canada, including in northern Alberta, and they require large areas of undisturbed habitat that include mature to old-growth forests, lowland muskags, and peatlands, and upland hilly areas. So habitat alteration from both anthropogenic and natural sources and increased predation from that habitat alteration have led to local population declines throughout the distribution. Specifically in Alberta, where there's multiple resource development activities happening on the landscape, linear footprint features, particularly from seismic exploration activities, have been particularly problematic dissecting caribou habitat, as you can see in the picture on the left. Unlike other oil and gas footprint, these features historically were not required to be restored or reclaimed following their use, and their natural recovery has been slow and in some cases non-existent, more than 30 years without any vegetation. So industry, as part of recovery options for caribou, has started to step in and explore opportunities to restore historic footprint within the caribou ranges. And one such initiative got underway back in 2011 with a group of oil sands companies that came together to initiate a pilot operation to restore some legacy footprint in the northeastern Alberta caribou range. So the 6 companies are all members of Canada's Oil Sands Innovation Alliance and developed a tactical plan to restore over 300 kilometers legacy seismic footprint. And the plan called for using site preparation and tree planting techniques similar to forestry to deactivate the footprint and set it on a trajectory to recover caribou habitat. So it is a longer-term management strategy to help recover critical caribou habitat. And so what was accomplished in this project was over a 4-year span, the partners planted over 161,000 trees, helping to establish contiguous caribou habitat in a 56,000 hectare area. Another unique aspect to this project was the operational pilot of winter tree planting. Due to the remote and lowland conditions, access to these areas is only available in the winter, and therefore special procedures and techniques were required. The monitoring program that's been ongoing has shown success in establishing vegetation cover on these lines and putting the growth on a track to restored habitat. So during the course of this project, the question started being asked about what other benefits are being created through this habitat restoration. And so they knew that they were restoring caribou habitat, but by planting trees, they're also adding timber back to the forest, which in turn has carbon storage benefits as well. So the question was being asked if we could quantify this change and identify any other additional benefits that hadn't been thought about before. The purpose would be to allow to assess implications of linear restoration on other possible offset systems that may come into place in Alberta, and also to help lay the groundwork for understanding the costs associated with doing these restoration programs, and could doing an ecosystem services type approach help further justify the costs. As you can imagine, when we talk about winter tree planting and things, those techniques are not cheap, and so any opportunities to potentially offset those costs are something to be interested in looking at. So one of the challenges was, from an industry's perspective, is that taking it from a research sort of academic center into an applicable practical project hadn't been done too much before. So what the partners had to come together to make a plan to make a very easy to implement, transferable and repeatable framework that could be used in other areas of the province. And so to do this, a group of industry, government, and NGOs were brought together to help to work with us to develop this framework for assessing changes from management alternatives in an ecosystem services setting that would be repeatable, transferable, and transparent. And so one of the first steps in this process was, first of all, determining what the relevant ecosystem services are to assess for a particular project. And this was worked through by developing a process to follow to connect stakeholder values of a given region or location to biophysical change that might happen from the specific management alternatives that are being looked at. So in this case, it's linear restoration, but the idea is that this would be able to be applied to other types of decision making in terms of development, restoration, etc. So the study looked at 2 streams for the analysis. We did an ecosystem service assessment on what was gained from intervention with linear restoration on these seismic lines in this particular pilot area versus what would have happened if no intervention occurred. And so the particular ecosystem services that were identified for this project and for this pilot study were water quality, climate regulation, cultural values, which include moose and caribou, timber supply, and genetic diversity. So we developed recovery trajectories for each of these ecosystem services based on the growth trajectories of the trees that were planted on the lines. And we were able to do a comparison at the future state of under a no intervention scenario and a restoration scenario. The intent was that this would allow us to look at what are those potential additional benefits being generated from linear restoration, but also how can this process be developed to be incorporated in other land management decisions, and and recommendations within an offset framework as well. And so the assessment used peer-reviewed modeling platforms to estimate the ecological change on the identified ecosystem services. And then a combination of both market-based willingness to pay and avoided costs were used to value that biophysical change. So across the top of this table are the specific ecosystem service indicators that were analyzed. The green row at the bottom represents the specific measures of biophysical change after 30 years that were quantified for each ecosystem service. And the orange row represents the economic response and evaluation associated with that biophysical change. And so thinking back when Toni, earlier in the presentation when Toni was showing that we're trying to move from dealing with individual units of biophysical response in green to a more of a common dollar value to help assess impacts, and that's what this approach is trying to show here. So trying to get at that dollar value of economic response for each indicator. However, as she also mentioned, there are cases where a dollar value isn't necessarily appropriate for a particular or available to be assigned to a particular ecosystem service. For example, in this case, genetic diversity, the project team determined that it wasn't appropriate to be able to quantify an economic value for this particular indicator. The timber supply climate regulation values were derived using market-based approaches. The caribou habitat improvement was based on a willingness to pay estimate, and water purification was valued through avoided treatment costs. And the last one for moose, in our analysis, we didn't have a significant change in response to moose, so there was no value assigned to it. So this is an example of how we can take from land-based decisions and trade-off analysis and look at, quantify those biophysical responses, and then assign an economic value to those. So just outcomes from this project was that from a linear restoration perspective, there's been lots of expansion in this area across the province in terms of additional habitat restoration projects. And while the primary driver for those is still largely caribou focused, a lot of folks are still starting to ask that question about what are the additional benefits that we can get, and how could we prioritize areas to get the most ecological benefit for the least amount of restoration dollars, as it is an expensive endeavor. And so can we strategically prioritize areas for treatment based on multiple values instead of a single species approach? And further to that, the outcomes from this are helping to test potential elements of an offset program. And as Toni mentioned earlier, that the government of Alberta is currently developing a draft conservation offset policy, which will articulate their intent as to how offsets will fit within the various regulatory systems and identify a set of common requirements for each regulatory offset program as well. So that's a case study of how we've taken sort of those ecosystem services concepts and applied it into practical application, and now using those learnings to examine further how can this, we're currently in the process of project of scaling this up and looking at how can we look at this in a larger landscape and what are the implications there as well. So I'll turn this back to Toni now just to wrap up with a few opportunities and challenges that we foresee ahead.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Can everybody still hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you, Toni.
Okay, good. So we're having some problems with our audio while Andrew's talking. Just wanted to make sure. Okay, well, thanks, Andrew, for that brief discussion on the case study. Shifting gears a little bit now to what does this all really mean, and what are the upcoming opportunities for industry to get involved in this type of assessment and policy development. So the first opportunity is incorporating natural capital dependencies into environmental impact assessments. There's been a few academic studies or academic related studies on this in the past, and the World Resource Institute also just came out with kind of a book to do things, or a how-to book on it as well last year. And as I mentioned earlier on in my presentation, the federal government is set to release their ecosystem service toolkit in the coming months, hopefully next month. And in that will be a chapter dedicated to how to incorporate natural capital and ecosystem services directly into environmental impact assessments. So this is really an easy entry point for the natural resource sector to get involved in assessing ecosystem services. Alberta is also launching their own research initiative with Alberta Innovates this year to incorporate ecosystem services into the province environmental impact assessment. And the purpose of that project is to identify what it means in terms of changes in scope of the current processes, and including stakeholder engagement. So if your company is a natural resource company and you'd be interested in getting involved in this project, please let me know following this webinar. I'd love to touch base with you. We are in the process of developing a steering committee, so all input would be helpful. There's also a number of different opportunities that I touched on briefly, and I'd like to take a few moments here to discuss them a little bit more. So the focus of this webinar was on conservation offsets and how ecosystem service assessments can help in either planning for restoration projects that want to use a conservation offset, or identifying what all of the benefits of a restoration project could provide for in the scheme of a conservation offset program. There's also a number of different opportunities that the private sector can use. One would be reducing your operational risk. So I touched on that briefly earlier on, and what I mean by that is identifying all your natural capital, not only impacts, but also what you depend on in the natural environment, can help reduce the risk of one of your inputs either being no longer able to be supplied, or if water quality level or water storage levels go down to a point where you're no longer able to take water from an existing source, that would obviously shut down operations. So it's good to start thinking about it as a landscape view, and ecosystem service assessments can help you do that. Ecosystem services also, as I mentioned a few times, directly link human well-being to the natural environment, and this can really help with stakeholder engagement. Andrew went through that 6-step process that we use to develop, to assess what local communities care about for a restoration project. So following a similar scheme that's transparent and repeatable really helps maintain that social license to operate for large companies that are operating on public land. There's also the opportunity to partner with other service industries that could potentially fund restoration projects because they're benefiting from them downstream. There's a current pilot project happening in California where restoration projects are improving water quality and water storage for downstream users. So those projects are actually being funded through forest resilience bonds or green bonds by insurance companies or utility companies who benefit more from those restoration projects. So that's an opportunity as well when you're taking an ecosystem service lens to land use planning. Lastly, there's currently no private mitigation banks in Canada, but if conservation offsets are more widely adopted, this could definitely change in the future. Of course, with a significant shift away from the status quo, there's still a number of unknowns we're dealing with. With a lot of restoration work occurring on public land, especially in Canada, there's issues surrounding ownership and ensuring the future permanence of a restoration project. So how do we know if we're going to go restore seismic lines on public land? How do we know that a forestry company isn't going to come along in 5 years and cut that area? So these are issues that the private sector will need to continue to work with the government to ensure that they're dealt with before this goes large mainstream. There's also issues surrounding meeting thresholds and aggregating benefits at a large scale. So the land use framework, as I mentioned, splits the province into 7 planning regions, and they each have their own biodiversity management framework. These are large chunks of land, and many restoration projects are going to happen on that landscape. So how do we determine what restoration project provides those benefits, and at what scale do we buy and sell conservation offsets? So those are just some of the upcoming challenges that we're going to have to deal with. But it's an exciting time, and I'm excited to see where this goes. I'm just going to summarize our presentation, and then we'll open it up for discussion. So in summary, the Government of Alberta is shifting to outcome-focused regulation, and specifically with the use of conservation offsets. And ecosystem service assessments can help make that shift a little bit easier. The Ecosystem Service and Biodiversity Network, which was established in 2015, is dedicated to providing high-quality data through multiple research initiatives. And this includes the Bioresource Information Management System that we talked about and ABMI's Ecosystem Service Mapping. The use of conservation offsets, or the opportunity that conservation offsets prevails, is spurring innovation and large-scale restoration on public land. So there are a few first movers that are starting to do large-scale restoration now, which is exciting to see. There's also additional opportunities to use ecosystem service concepts to reduce operational risk for your company, as well as identify new revenue opportunities. And there's also the opportunity to get involved in mitigation banking and/or additional conservation offset planning through the use of prioritizing areas for restoration using an ecosystem service lens. So lastly, I just want to end on that incorporating natural capital into policy and decision-making adds value to the private sector. We need to stop thinking of just our impacts on the environment, but also what are our dependencies and how can we identify those to reduce supply chain risk. It's also not as scary as we think. There's a lot of subject matter experts out there that exist now that can help businesses identify those opportunities and risks related to ecosystem services and the environment. So we'll end it there. This is our contact information if you do want to get a hold of us after the webinar. And I've also compiled some additional resources if you wanted to either, if something really sparks your interest and you want to do a little bit more research on it. And there's also some non-Albertan links there as well. Okay.
Wonderful. Thanks, Toni and Andrew. We've been getting a number of questions coming in. Of course, we'll answer as many of them as we can with the time that's left. If you do have your questions, you can enter them into the chat and Q&A box. The first question is directed to you, Andrew. One of the participants is wondering what the parameters are for measuring how much the ecosystem has been affected by the footprints and/or lifestyle.
So I think that the framework that we've been looking at right now is looking in terms of that pilot study, set aside a parameters looking at 30 years into the future, just from a restoration perspective, knowing the time it takes for trees to establish and start to generate some of those ecosystem services. But that said, there's no, I think, written rules around what those parameters are. And so we used 30 years, and we discounted those valuation as well, using a net present value 4% to get an estimate there to account for some of that risks and things that Toni was talking about. And so that's how we're quantifying sort of from a time perspective. And then further to that, I guess it kind of comes down to in the process of what ecosystem services are determined to be relevant given what your project might influence and what stakeholders have identified in a particular region as important. And that, I think, helps define some of those parameters around what's actually included in the analysis for, and that's at least that's the vision for what would be included in the analysis of an ecosystem service assessment. I hope that.
Wonderful, thanks.
Yeah.
Oh, that's perfect. And so now, going forward, they haven't indicated who they want to answer. So Toni or Andrew, you can jump in depending on who wants to respond. So one of the other questions was if you could elaborate on some of the metrics used to express human well-being.
I'll take a first stab at that, Toni.
Sure.
The Millennium Ecosystem Service Assessment outlines a number of ecosystem services, and it's kind of a standard document when turning to what those types of ecosystem services are. And again, coming down to the process, those stakeholders don't necessarily, communities don't necessarily speak in those same terms in terms of understanding what the biophysical changes are and those ecosystem services that are affecting them. They might understand values at a higher level, and that's where it comes down to trying to understand what those values are and making the connections to specific ecosystem services and things that are affecting their well-being. I don't know if you have anything to add to that, Toni.
Yeah, no, I think you answered that really well. Yeah, I think the important thing is what you said, that the stakeholder engagement is to help identify what people do care about, what benefits they are getting from nature. And then we take that and look at it and say, okay, they really care about having access to fish or have fishable waters. So what does that mean in terms of ecosystem services? How can we model that? And then is there a significant change from this management alternative that we're doing? And that's kind of how we make that link between human well-being and biophysical change that's happening on the landscape. Hopefully that answers your question.
Perfect. So yes, I think people are very interested in that information, those couple of slides. We have another question on how do you put an economic value on biodiversity when thousands of species are potentially involved?
All right, I can take this one, Andrew, if you want. So we actually didn't value biodiversity because it is a supporting service that affects multiple different ecosystem services. So biodiversity improves wildlife habitat. It also, a healthy functioning ecosystem has improved water quality, that kind of thing. So all of those feed in, and that's why when we measure genetic diversity, we note that there is a change from the baseline, but we don't put a dollar value on it because we've already valued the timber supply, caribou habitat, carbon sequestration, and so on. There's a lot of different resources out there that can help you identify how to put an economic value on the different ecosystem services and the different methods that can be used. By all means, we can provide some of that information if you want. The Ecosystem Service and Biodiversity Network has a toolkit where there's a ton of research posted that's downloadable and available to the public, which is a really helpful resource for anybody that's interested in knowing more.
Thanks, Toni. I'll also jump in here just to remind participants that we will send out the PowerPoint slides as well as the recording after today's session, and the recording will include the question period. So again, you'll have that for your future reference. We also had another question about outcome-based regulation work. So how does outcome-based regulation work when companies have to keep the regulations before the outcomes of their activities are fully known. So I will repeat that because that was a bit of a mouthful for myself.
Sure.
So how does outcome-based regulation work when companies have to heed the regulations before the outcomes of their activities are fully known?
Okay, so a direct shift to outcome-focused regulation would be the government saying, we don't want you to go below these ecological targets. We don't care how you meet them, just don't go below them, and we'll be happy. So a great example of that is, say that a chemical plant was had effluent going into a stream that was warming the stream and killing the fish. The government can say, you can't go below 2-degree change in this stream, and then that company that's polluting the stream can either pay farmers to plant trees on the stream to reduce the amount of sun that's getting on the stream and control the temperature of the stream that way, or they can put more gray infrastructure in place to reduce the way that the heating is happening or the pollution is heating the stream. If that makes sense. Maybe not the greatest example, but it's more of a hands-off approach to say, you can figure it out, and it's up to the companies to figure out how to stay under those outcomes, if that makes sense. I don't know, Andrew, if you had anything else you wanted to add to that.
Sure, yeah. There's some examples in BC, in the Northeast region for where they have area-based analysis in place, and that has sort of threshold-type outcome-based requirements on certain indicators and things. And what we've helped some of our clients in that space is understand what their future outcomes may be from their footprint. And so some of that future effect of what happens today and not knowing what it will be 10 years down the road, some of those ecological questions can be answered through modeling exercises and assumptions. And so that's one way of helping to show, and then it becomes more of a monitoring exercise that after that, are you meeting the targets that have been set out? And if not, can we adjust course?
Andrew did a much better job of explaining that.
I appreciate both of your responses, and I'm sure our participants do as well. We will continue to switch back and forth between what participants are hoping to learn. So hope you guys are ready for this. So can you comment on the policy framework for conservation offsets in Ontario? So shifting from Alberta to Ontario.
I cannot. I would love to follow up with you afterwards. Like you said, our expertise is in Alberta, so we don't really know a whole lot of what's going on in Ontario, but I'd love to learn more. I know that Ontario has a very similar ecosystem service and biodiversity network called the Ontario Network on Ecosystem Services that has a lot of guidance material that members believe is relevant to ecosystem services in Ontario. So I'd love to follow up with whoever asked that question afterwards and discuss it more with them if that